Okay, good morning. I'm Rox Montrastelli, and I'm here representing Loretto and Latin American Caribbean Committee. We started doing the Immigration Spotlight during COVID to try to keep us connected with what was happening at the border and with the realities of our farm workers. And in the process, we made a lot of different connections and met a lot of new people, have created great friendships. And we find out that there's really a lot of need out there, but there's also a lot of really good work going on. So today we're going to be talking with the National Farm Worker Ministry, and we're going to start with a prayer that Mary Jean's going to share, as long as her computer doesn't kick her out.
You watch.
Okay, go Mary Jean.
Just a sec. Okay. This is a prayer written by Cesar Chavez. Prayer of the farm worker struggle. Show me the suffering of the most miserable, so I will know my people's plight. Free me to pray for others, for you are present in every person. Help me take responsibility for my own life, so that I can be free at last. Grant me courage to serve others, for in service there is true life. Give me honesty and patience, so that I can work with other workers. Bring forth song and celebration, so that the Spirit will be alive among us. Let the Spirit flourish and grow, so that we will never tire of the struggle. Let us remember those who have died for justice, for they have given us life. Help us love even those who hate us, so that we can change the world. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mary Jean. So Julie said that she wasn't too big on bios, but I do have a short bio on both of the ladies joining us today. And we know quite a bit about them, but it's always fun to find out something new. And I'm going to get corrected if I didn't get it right. Okay. So Julie Taylor is Executive Director of National Farm Worker Ministry. She's originally from Alabama, and she spent time working with churches and church-related ministries living in Virginia, D.C., and New York City, and now North Carolina. She came to National Farm Worker Ministry Board in 2000 as a representative of the United Ministry Women, United Methodist Women. For 15 years, Julie worked at the National Office of the United Methodist Women, focusing on child and family advocacy for 15 years. During that time, she sat on the board of National Farm Worker Ministry with a term as vice president, several terms on the executive committee. And now for the past 9 years, she's been the executive director. She has previous experience in hunger education and advocacy for the Society of St. Andrews, with a bachelor's in Christian education and a master's in Christian spiritual formation and leadership. Julie has a lifetime of social justice advocacy, connecting people of faith and conscience to ways they can stay in solidarity with the marginalized in society. Julie brings a growing passion for advocacy and working with farm workers. We also have today the Director of Farm Advocacy and National Farm Worker Ministry, Elizabeth Rodriguez. Elizabeth is from Rio Grande Valley, raised in a large Mexican-American family and mother of 5. She is a product of a generation of farm workers, parents who met as migrants in the fields, and grandparents who came into this country through the Bracero program. In 2016, Elizabeth joined the Carnomismo Brown Berets and began advocating for community needs. She graduated from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in 2017 with a bachelor's in social work and a background in cultural anthropology. In 2018, she began to build relationships with farm workers to bring awareness to human trafficking in agriculture. She worked at La Unión del Pueblo Entro, Lupe, as a community organizer. During COVID, she joined a coalition of nonprofit organizations. They helped over 2,000 farm workers and their families receive priority for COVID vaccines and personal protective equipment delivered to their work sites. She also helped more than 2 dozen farm workers recover over 100,000 in unpaid wages. After the pandemic, she was part of a team that helped distribute one-time COVID relief funds to farm workers for their work during the pandemic as part of a USDA grant. She received a master's in social work in the spring of 2024. Congratulations. While participating as a research assistant with the Alford research team, collecting data with farm workers. Okay. And I go on and say there is no way you can capsulize a lifetime of work of you amazing folks in a couple paragraphs. But that's the background. And so now, Julie and Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Rox. And the truth is, there's a lifetime of service sitting right here in the midst of all of us. I mean, it's not just us. We know you and we know the work that you've done, and we're very grateful for it. And we're grateful to be a part of it along with you, and grateful for your support of our work. So when Rox and I were talking about this meeting, I said, well, how about if we take a kind of informal approach, not lots of, I did not prepare a slide presentation. I just I wanted to share with you a bit of what we're working on this year, because this year our theme has been immigration, and we have focused on that. And we'll talk about some aspects of that, some things that are coming up. And I know Rox is constantly sharing our things with you. So if you follow that, then you're already familiar with that. Also wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the theme that we're preparing for 2025, which is farm worker housing, and some things that really Elizabeth and I have witnessed and experienced over the last few months as she has come to work for us. And we have been in farm worker communities in different parts of the country. And so what we're thinking about by way of putting that together. And then we had the privilege this last weekend of being part of the United Farm Worker Union's convention in Bakersfield. And so we're with lots of amazing, inspiring people, including Dolores Huerta, Arturo Rodriguez, Paul Chavez, Cesar Chavez's son, and his grandson, Andreas, and a whole wealth of other individuals, including farm workers, there to make decisions about the next 4 years. They have a very democratic process, as many of you know, and so are actively involved in their own directions and leadership. So that's kind of an overview. I wanted to allow some time where we could hear your questions and have some conversation. This work is constantly emerging, and pieces of it feel like they don't change, the context of them does. And so we're grateful for the opportunity to be with you. So I'm going to say a few things about immigration at this point, and then I'm gonna ask Elizabeth to share some additional things, because we have a petition out there. We have some plans for the petition and how it will be shared with people who are in positions to make decisions, and we have a webinar coming up around that. But I mean, immigration, you well know, because this is the focus of your Fridays, that immigration across the board in all areas is a challenge, particularly for low income and marginalized persons, refugees, asylum seekers. Many of you are or have been involved in border ministries, and you've heard the testimony of lots of people about the challenges that are at the border. In January, we specifically went to Brownsville, Texas, to meet with people who are working a bit on both sides of the border, but also just to see some of the realities there, which were so different than the realities that have been shown on the national news. The ways in which Brownsville as a community has sought to bring people into the country, work with them, as many of our border ministries do, and help them, be treated with dignity and fairness and some sensitivity to the realities that cause them to come to our borders. And so we took our board there. We had a vigil, a prayer there at near one of the border crossings in view of the Matamoros Bridge, and just there looking at the fence and having heard about the realities of people. We visited some people who were, I want to say, kind of in holding. A woman who was really maybe 8 months pregnant, about to give birth. So she was resting in a Catholic church right there at the border, so that she was well taken care of in those early days of her arrival. And then some other people with serious disabilities who managed to get that far. But the church wanted to particularly provide them a place of respite. But we wanted to give our board members a chance to see different visions of what happens at the border, just like you have over this period of time since COVID, as you focused on immigration and continuing to recognize that there's so many myths out there about what's happening at the border. I hope you've had a chance to see the short video that we produced this year, where we listen to the voices of farm workers about their experiences, and wanted to be able to get that out, so that people had different information that we felt was very reliable, but also focused on the humanity of people, and our resources that are attached to that do some of that. But we've been working on a petition. I'm going to invite Elizabeth to share just a little bit about the petition. I'll just preface it by saying I spoke with our board president yesterday, Nate Hostler. He happens to be with Church of the Brethren. And there are several of our board members who work in Washington, D.C. in policy offices. But as you may be familiar, Harvest of Justice, we've had our resources released most of this year, but we do a particular push of those resources in that topic during Harvest of Justice season, which starts on Labor Day by design, because farm work is also a labor issue. But it ends on World Food Day. And we do that by design as well, because we recognize that there are farm workers who literally are hungry. They can't afford the food that they pick. And so we've partnered with the Presbyterian Hunger Program for a number of years to spotlight hunger issues with farm workers. And so the other thing I want Elizabeth to share with you about is that on World Food Day, we will be hosting our second webinar of the year. We did the original one on immigration in June, and the second part of the focus of immigration is to look specifically at the H-2A guest worker program, that program that brings farm workers into our country to do the seasonal harvesting work in the field. And so we're going to focus on that on Wednesday, October 16th. So Elizabeth, if you'll share a little bit about those two things, that'd be great.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much, Julie. So yes, immigration is a very important topic, right? It is affecting so many of the people that have lived here in this country for generations. We have mixed status families. We have farm workers that have U.S. citizen children. We have dreamers that didn't qualify, or weren't able to get DACA. I live in Texas. So as many of you know, in Texas, DACA was forbidden. So there's a lot of people that haven't been able to access the program. And it's the immigration system is really hard for people who do not have uh, the income. It's hard for them to access it. So National Farm Worker Ministry is circulating a petition that we want to deliver to Congress to make sure that they sit down and start working on immigration reform. Several there's several bills that have already been proposed, but as many of you know, they have not gone through. And this is a very important topic for our community. All across the board, everybody is just, I mean, we're praying for immigration reform. It's one of the reasons why, our population is so vulnerable and why they're at a high risk for wage theft and labor exploitation, uh, which is, their keys for human trafficking. So this petition, I'm going to put the link in the chat as soon as I'm done talking so that all of you can access it, help us get signatures on it. So that I believe right now we're up over 300. So we want to get as many signatures as we can. If you can help us with that, that would be amazing. And we would really, really greatly appreciate it. And second, we're going to be having a webinar October 16th. And I'll make sure to post that, to include that link in the chat as well, so that all of you can sign up. We have 2 guests. One of our guests is a lawyer from Indiana who specializes in H-2A law. And we have another fellow organizer who has created his own nonprofit organization. It is called Cierto. He works with H-2A workers from Mexico and Guatemala, helping them through the application process, making sure that they understand their rights, and then he follows up with them when they get back to Mexico. And so the H-2A program is quickly becoming the system or the preferred system for agriculture. That H-2A system is also leaving a lot of our farm workers that, like I've said, they've been here for generations. It's leaving them vulnerable because now they're facing having to compete with H-2A workers who are predominantly young men who can work rapidly. And because they're in Mexico, if their rights are violated, often they're not aware. They come from indigenous communities, so a lot of them do not know how to read or write or do basic math. They don't understand the concept of wage theft, and they, a lot of times these H-2A men are also extremely vulnerable, and they have no idea, that they're coming in and having and competing with these families. There's a lot happening in our communities, and I think that it's important that we have these real conversations, because like a lot of these farm workers that I'm talking about, they're quickly going into retirement age. They're in their 60s, 70s. I've witnessed and I've seen farm workers working well into their 80s, into their 90s, when they can't even see anymore. And it's, it, to me, it's unethical. They should be able to retire. They have US citizen children, and they have to pay high taxes on their properties. They cannot survive if they don't work. So this is an extreme topic that I think that more people should be aware of. What farm workers, but not just farm workers, essential workers, immigrants are facing every day, and in the quality of life that they're living, simply because they cannot afford an immigration process, or they cannot afford to stop working. Hunger is a real issue, and Many of them don't qualify for government assistance, and food pantries are the only thing that keeps them moving forward. If they're undocumented, then they can't travel. So there's periods of time when they do not work, and they have to find ways to survive for 2 to 3 months out of the year, which means that, you know, their money is focused on paying their rent, their utilities, and it's hard for them to maintain their families, especially if they have little ones and they have to, buy them clothes or feed them. So there's so many struggles that I could sit here and we could talk for hours about everything that I've seen. On top of the fact that a lot of we hear this false narrative that then creates a false impression of immigrants, and then they have to face discrimination and racism when they're out there. And that also, is very hurtful and painful to see and to experience. So I hope that all of you will take just a couple of minutes so that you can register for the webinar, but also sign the petition so that we can help push for immigration reform. And if you want to, take it a step above and go speak to your representatives. Go speak to those leaders that we have in office and let them know how important this is for us. How we treat our immigrants is, it's a reflection of how we treat our people. It is a reflection of America, and the world is watching. So we need to make sure that, that they have their basic needs are being met. I mean, that's all they want. They would be so grateful for a work permit, because they are hardworking people, and they know they take a lot of pride. They're not looking for handouts. They're looking for hand ups so that they can improve their lives. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak here, and I will stick around if anybody has any questions for me, and I'll be working on those links so that I can put them in the chat.
Thanks, Elizabeth. What I want to do is sort of move from some of the things that she shared to the focus that we have on this upcoming webinar that's on H-2A workers. And that has led us really to preparing the focus for 2025 on farm worker housing. In part because what we're seeing more and more is that as these groups of H-2A workers are brought into this country, they're placed in labor camps. A lot of the farm labor camps, as you well know, are in pretty rural areas. They're isolated areas. And one of the requirements of the H-2A program is to provide housing. It's employer-provided housing for these workers. And so in North Carolina, we see a lot of them you have to go there to actually find them. You have to go down this little road to this little road to a dirt road, and it's behind, a set of trees. You can't even see it from where you are. And it's an old house that's been there for a while. And some of those old houses are fine. Some of those houses are substandard. Some of them don't have running water, which is unbelievable in 2024. The other thing that we're seeing is that some of these groups come in pretty large groups, and they're put in labor camps that are then, they build chain link fences around them. They put barbed wire on the top of them. I was talking to a migrant ministries leader from Bethel Ministries. They're were formed by the Presbyterians in Florida, and they're southeast of Tampa, Florida. Probably having a lot of rain today from Hurricane Helene, but she said there was an old church camp there that had been abandoned for a while. COVID shut down a lot of camp kinds of things and things that took place where people would come and stay in the summer. And so she wondered what was going to happen to it. And then she saw that, they put up a sign to sell it. The sign was taken down. This is on her way to work. She could see this happening. And so she was like, oh, good. I'm interested to see who bought the property. What are they going to do with it? You know, it's in our neighborhood. And then she saw, trucks and work teams come in to, do some improvements on the housing and that sort of thing. She's like, oh, good. Maybe they're going to open this up for the area community. But then she saw a chain link fence go up around it and then barbed wire on the top. And so when she told me about it, I was like, well, in Florida, I wouldn't be surprised that you might have barbed wire on the bottom because of alligators and creatures like that. But on the top, that sounds like a detention center. That sounds like a prison. And then the doors are closed and locked. Elizabeth has shared a lot about places in South Texas where it's posted no trespassing. So people up until this time, the experience generally has been that farm workers in these labor camps, they work a lot. So it's not like they can have a lot of visitors, but late evenings and on the weekends, that's when our organizers go to talk to them. That's when Migrant Ministries goes to take, the Eucharist or just goes to visit with them and that sort of thing. And to see these barriers even to what we would consider to be, their home away from home. I mean, this is an employment relationship, right? So it's been distressing. We were up in the Yakima, Washington area last month. And one of the Migrant Ministries leaders up there, who's part of the Catholic the Catholic Migrant Farm Worker Network. They're part of our board, and I got to meet her in North Carolina, but we were up there, we went by to visit her, and she said, we are visiting a farm labor camp that's here in the city. It has 1,400 workers at an old hotel in the city. And so we didn't have time because of our other commitments to go visit it or to see what it looked like. But Elizabeth looked at on one of those Google maps where they show you the street view. And I was horrified. Chain link fence, lock on the front. So 1,400 workers come and go from there on a regular basis to harvest the fruit and things in the area. And then when they're home at night, they're locked in. And so that part of housing has been really distressing to us. And I did an interview a couple days ago with a reporter who was asking me about, this current administration released some, sort of a new rule about H-2A workers that in general provides for them to do, to organize without retaliation as part of the H-2A visa program. It sort of operates under the idea, because that the federal labor does not protect farm workers or domestic workers in the U.S. from the right to organize without retaliation. That was part of our farm workers and racism information from last year. And so, and you may have read about this case in the news, but there was a human trafficking case in Georgia called Blooming Onion, where there were a whole set of workers they took their passports, they locked them in facilities, had them go out and work, brought them in and locked them in at night. They kept wages. They didn't provide adequate food for them. So there were some of those farm workers who escaped. They actually made their way to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers for assistance. The coalition got the FBI. There was a long investigation, and then eventually indictments, and some people are going to jail for that. But it was a huge case from the state of Georgia, and Georgia primarily employs H-2A workers. So once the Biden administration put out this rule that said H-2A workers across the country have the right to organize without retaliation in these new regulations. The Georgia Attorney General and some other attorney generals in southeastern states, along with, covering I think it's 17 states in the Southeast on their behalf, but basically to block this rule of the Biden administration. So now it's in the courts, but this is what the reporter wanted to ask me about. And I said, it was kind of fascinating to me that the most recent and egregious human trafficking case came out of Georgia, and Georgia wants to stop precisely the Biden regulations, which sought to protect H-2A workers from being exploited in that way. The other thing that was interesting is that of all the investigations in 2023, about 90% of the investigations of human trafficking were in agriculture were in the Southeast. So there's an inconsistency there, right? There's something that really sort of challenges us about that. So I wanted to share those things in relation to immigration specifically, and then there were just a couple other things that I wanted to mention to you, and then have us go into a time of questions and dialogue or whatever. But the other thing, sorry about that, my phone is across the room. The other thing is we were at the United Farm Workers Union convention last week, and we have been working on basically two campaigns related to them. One is, and this is the reason we were in Washington State, we were at windmill mushrooms. And you may have heard, and we have this on our list of videos on YouTube, but we did an interview with an organizer from there and also a worker for windmill mushrooms. So she tells us in great detail about the harassment she received from windmill mushrooms and what was going on there. So Elizabeth and I followed that. That was at our summer board meeting in July. We followed that just with an opportunity to go visit with the windmill mushroom workers. And this past weekend, because more things have happened, but this past weekend at the UFW convention, the windmill workers were there. They got a petition together. There's something like 250 delegates to the UFW convention that are farm workers representing farm workers across the country. And they got 100 of them to sign a petition to boycott windmill mushrooms. So we're not really announcing that or doing anything else with that, except kind of wait to what are the details about that. Will it just be windmill mushrooms in Washington? Will it be windmill mushrooms and their avenues of distribution? But when we know more, we'll share more and invite you to participate on that with us. And then and I think I may have shared what I intended for Elizabeth to share. Sorry about that. The other is a wonderful company in California. Farm workers have been trying to organize at the wonderful company. The headquarters is based in Los Angeles, but it's actually a national, international kind of company. But they're at the stage where we've been sending faith leader communications to them to ask them to work with the UFW on a contract. And there was actually a vote, and then there were challenges to the vote. The California Agriculture Labor Relations Board investigated those challenges and found that the wonderful company had influenced people to make up to say that somebody from the UFW misled me, somebody, forced me to do this or whatever. And those were all found to be disputed. But the wonderful company now has filed an injunction against one of the California state laws related to even having an ALRB and having this new way to vote that they worked so hard on 2 years ago, to be able to not have to vote on the property of the company, but to be able to do mail-in votes or to have to sign vote cards that get turned in. And if they have a majority, then the UFW becomes their union representative. So that's in court. So we're writing the owners of the company, asking them to do the right thing. So we may expand that even more than we have so far. But those are two things that we learned more about at the UFW convention. Elizabeth, did you want to say more about the windmill mushrooms workers?
Well, I think that I can add what I can add to is that, they continue to be to work under extreme conditions. And they are, they're trying their best to hang in there, and you mentioned, right, Julie, that they are going, they're asking, or they just approved a boycott.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, of windmill mushrooms. Um, but also, they really want to bring this to attention. They want people to be aware of what's happening in their communities, and they're welcoming the support. They're welcoming any support because they're having a hard time um, being recognized, so that they can join that union, so they can be part of the union. So I think that's pretty much what I've said. Julie covered the majority, but they're one of the groups that is having to compete with H2A workers. And that's why they're being pressured to produce at higher levels. They're being harassed so that they can feel unwelcomed, and so that they can quit on their own, so that they can feel that pressure to quit. There's a lot of situations that they're going through, and the ones that are being targeted the most are the women and people that are over the age of 50, 55. So those are the dynamics. And like Julie mentioned, we found that there was a hotel with 1,400 H2A workers close by. So it just, we were puzzled because it sounds more affordable for you to employ local employees rather than having to bring in foreign workers. But like I stated before, a lot of these workers are indigenous. They don't know how to read or write. They're not aware that they're not being paid the wages that they were promised. And so, there's a lot that we're hoping is going to develop sooner or later. So if you just watch the case closely, these workers are really working hard towards exposure on what's happening there with them. And we're going to continue to monitor it closely as well. And we'll bring you all those updates as they're coming in.
Thank you. So I've shared a number of different things. So I wonder if there might be questions at this point. We'd be happy to talk about any of these things, go into more detail, or explore other areas of farm worker advocacy that we're doing. I will say, I think it was Barbara who dropped into the chat that Fiji Water is a project of wonderful company. The pomegranate juice, sort of, there's a new craze around that comes out of that company as well. So we've got some work to do to figure out how to convey that really well to consumers and give them easy ways to participate in however the UFW rolls out that boycott. But I'm sure they just approved it like Sunday morning, so it'll be coming in the next month or so.
The Wonderful also has pistachios.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yep.
And they
Okay,
do a lot of citrus.
Mhm.
I've got a couple of questions around, so windmill mushrooms, is that the group where they were doing mass firings?
Yes.
Like firing? Okay, so are those workers on H2A?
No.
No.
No, the ones that are being laid off are the ones that live locally in Sunnyside, and they're being replaced by H2A workers.
Okay.
So the whole premise of H2A is you can't find local workers to do it. So these people have been working, and if if you heard the woman, was it Sandra Chavez that was on the webinar with us? She had gotten really high reports about her work until she disagreed with them about the treatment of the workers, because she said they were always yelling and putting pressure on the workers, and they moved her into kind of a management position, and they wanted her to do the same. And she said, people don't work well that way. She refused to do it. And so then all of a sudden she became like the focus of being fired. We saw her again when we were in Yakima, and shortly after we left, they fired 100 workers without cause. So, and again, replace them with H2A workers, but they're firing people that are organizing, that are not because they're asking for tremendous things. They just want to be treated well. No, when she was talking about how much she was yelled at and everybody was yelled at, I was like, that's a terrible environment in which to work. So they complain about it because they don't really want to change the work they do. They do it well, right? And it's in their area, that sort of thing. So it's
So-
not that, it's about the treatment. Yeah.
So what's the status of the workers that have been fired?
So the community, they have a really strong community that's been trying to support them. In a lot of cases, it's not all from the same family. So it's putting a lot of pressure on other family members and their assistance. But the UFW has weekly meetings and has been trying to access resources to help them get through this period while they work to resolve it. But yeah, I mean, it's putting a strain. But there are other folks, family members, friends, and things in the community that are actually coming to some of their organizing meetings to show solidarity with them. So, and
they're
work within
not
the community.
they're not in danger of being deported?
No, these are most, well, I don't know about if they're making those kind of threats, but a lot of these people have been in the community for a long time.
Right, right.
I
When you were
believe that is, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe that, we don't ask their legal status, but I know that that is one of the things that they hear at work, is that they don't say, they don't say, oh, you're going to be deported. They say, if your social security number isn't right, you're going to be targeted for layoffs. So that's just one way of intimidating them, letting them know that that if they suspect anything about them, even if it might be factual or not, that they're going to target them for layoff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And like
When you
most of the communities where there's, a large population of undocumented people, there are also people that have documents, and they have this way of operating. I mean, they worry about going to the grocery store, but then they send one person, you know what I mean? Like they send an ambassador who they don't have to worry about so much. So they have ways of, bless their hearts, working around some of those kinds of threats, but it's still out there and they don't know.
It's another threat. So when you're talking about the wonderful company, you mentioned ALRB. What's
Mhm.
that?
So when the National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935, it created a National Labor Relations Board to oversee labor issues in the country. So in relation to forming unions and stuff like that, that was an arbitrator for that kind of thing. The fact that that law left out farm workers and domestic workers meant that the National Labor Relations Board doesn't cover farm workers. Do you know what I mean? So
Mhm.
they're not federally legally covered everywhere. California oh gosh, I'm not sure exactly what year, but California passed a law that created the Agriculture Labor Relations Board for the state of California. The law gave farm workers in California the right to organize without retaliation.
Okay,
And so it had to create a state entity to operate under that. So that's what the ALRB in California is. There is no other state that has an entity like that. Now, New York State several years ago passed a very comprehensive law for farm workers. Among other things, it gave the right to organize without retaliation. And then it also provided overtime, a phase-in program. It was really comprehensive. It's got a whole set of things in it. But once it created that, the United Farm Workers Union, it signed at least one contract with 500 workers in the state of New York. Some of the farm workers actually joined other unions because they just reached out to them. Like on Long Island, there were several established unions that expanded their bylaws to include farm work. But in other parts of the state, then like Rochester is where the UFW has been working the most. And we met their organizer up there, but they signed one for 500 workers there, maybe in some other places because they're doing that kind of organizing. But New York did not establish a state, agriculture relations board. It gave them the right to organize, and so then it has to go through the court system and stuff like that. But
thank you.
Can I come in? Ron?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, just thank you so much, Julie and Elizabeth, for this wealth of information. And thank you, Rox, for bringing it because I think it was long overdue. I think with all the border issues and all that's happening on the southern border and with the presidential campaign, we sort of overlook what's happening with the farm workers. It's overshadowed in the news, and I think that it's just so important to get an update and to hear about this. And I think the immigration reform petition we can certainly disseminate, and I think it's great to have. My question is around that. Is this effort only the National Farm Worker Ministry's petition, or is it aligned with other organizations that have also fed into developing it? It'd be good to know about that.
so the petition comes primarily from us. And so if you understand that the National Farm Worker Ministry seeks to work with all of the farm worker organizing groups in the country, it's challenging because they deal with issues differently. They deal with issues differently. So we have some of our farm worker organizing groups that would like to completely abolish the H-2A program. And I think really for until the recent years, even the UFW didn't really pay a lot of attention to it because it works so much with, what I would call residential workers in the state of California, not people that necessarily that come and go so much. But in the state of North Carolina, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee works almost entirely with H-2A workers, right? And there are other places where that's the case. So we discovered early on that getting all of the farm workers behind a bill didn't seem to be happening. There were several specific bills that were put forward, and so there was, support for it by some, and then, this opposition to it by others. So our petition, and that's been a little bit of a challenge, our petition is about some of the things that we knew from each of the farm worker partners was important. These things to us are important, like none of them like E-Verify.
Mhm.
There's a set of things in there that we included as more as statements and not as specific pieces of legislation, because there weren't pieces of legislation that brought everybody together. And so I think it's good and bad, because we feel confident about we don't represent farm workers, but we feel confident that this represents being in solidarity with all of them. And it raises some, specific issues in there and areas that we want to have a focus. But what it doesn't do, and why a lot of organizations or allies have not felt like they're not opposed to it, but they haven't signed on to it, because most everybody wants to work on a specific piece of legislation. And, like put everything behind a specific piece of legislation. And we waited a long time and we didn't find it. So that's why we put it together the way it is. And that's why on October 16th, we'll have some people from our board and supporters that will actually deliver it. Now, some of our faith partners have signed on to it because, they understand how that was put together, and they support us and this, sort of our aspect of it. But I sent it to the Farm Worker Association in Florida, because they're one of our close allies as far as just taking time to talk with us about issues and how we might work on them. I mean, all of them will do that to some extent, but they represent one of the smaller groups, but they have a really good understanding of everybody in the system.
Mhm.
So there have been some times when they've supported some things, like they had a very comprehensive pesticide bill that they wanted us to support. So we did, but it wasn't going. It was so comprehensive, it was too big. And we supported it, but we really put more time behind a more specific piece of legislation called ban organophosphates that the Alianza group of women farm workers was supporting. And we felt like that had a better chance, and they understood it. They encouraged us to do it. They said, we know what we're supporting is probably not going to go through, but these are all the pieces that we want to have. So, but I talked to the Farm Worker Association early on, and they said, this is nice. It's just, it's not something we certainly wouldn't oppose it, because it includes things that we're in favor of, but it's just not strong enough around a specific legislation for us to want to. Most everybody, when they sometimes they'll just add their name because they want to be in solidarity. But a lot of people thoughtfully, we try to do that. If you put your name on it, you want to do something with it. You're going to put it on social media. You're going to push it through. You're going to, have a strategy and a plan for it. And she said, we can't. So I was grateful for I love the candor of those conversations, and it didn't stop us from doing it, because we said, these are some of the pieces that we wanted to bring out in our videos. These are some of the pieces that we know are important. And so we can talk to, like our constituency and our faith partners and things about this. So, yeah.
Thank you. Gracias.
Sure.
Sally, do you have a question?
I do, yes.
Good.
Kind of politely waiting to be called upon, so thank you, Pat.
You're welcome.
Oh, Rox is muted. Maybe
it's good.
she's saying she
Yeah.
didn't see your hand up.
Things that I've heard that I'd like to hear a little bit more about. One is, Elizabeth, if I understood correctly, I think you said that DACA was forbidden in the state of Texas. And I wonder if you could talk, if I heard that right, could you talk a little bit more about that? And the second thing is, I'm just, as you, Julie, I'm just appalled to hear about the housing situations that are clearly detention centers. What's going on with that? And who is objecting to that? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sally, for that question. In the state of Texas, our local leaders or our governors or our leaders, political leaders, have decided that DACA is basically an illegal program. So they have not allowed anybody to apply for DACA. We, the National Farm Worker Ministry, worked on a short film. It is on YouTube. It's called Farm Worker and Their Immigration Struggles. And you can hear from one dreamer specifically. She had to raise the money to apply for DACA. She's been here her entire life. And when she went to go apply, the governor or our elected leaders shut down the program, and her application fell through. And so you can hear her testimony there on the YouTube video. It's a powerful testimony, and that's a reality that in Texas we are living. The immigration system is extremely hard, even when they're victims of a crime. Having to work with farm workers here in the state of Texas, especially even in the human trafficking area, it's hard to prove coercion unless there's actual violence.
Elizabeth, what I don't understand is I thought that DACA is a federal program. So how can one state say, no, you can't do it here?
Yeah, exactly. So our state has fought extremely hard to make sure that people are not allowed to apply for DACA. And not only that, the current executive order of that Joe Biden issued, they're working extremely hard to make sure that that doesn't happen in Texas either. Yes. So, you know, in Texas, we do have more extreme conditions. And, Julie, and one of you mentioned about, HOA workers being in these locations. I've seen visiting people here in the state of Texas, HOA workers. I've seen them not only living in deplorable conditions, but I've seen 16 men living in one bedroom with one restroom, no kitchen, having to cook outside, wash their clothes outside. So, and in another experience that I had, there were signs that said we shoot first and ask questions later. I didn't, me and my partner who were doing the outreach at that time, we decided we're not going to go further. But another close friend that also does similar work, she said when she approached, the gate was open. So they proceeded to go into the property. They were going to visit the HOA workers. And if they're living there, they have the right to accept company or to refuse company. Well, before they could reach the workers, men jumped out in camouflage with AK-47s and pointed them at their heads. And they had to immediately flee the property. And so these are the experiences. They're in, not to mention that they're in isolated areas where GPS and, your phone will not work. So you have to use map out and follow the directions so that you can reach their locations. There's a lot of these situations that happen here in Texas.
And Sally, I think part of what you're asking is how can they do this? How do they get away with it or whatever? So I'm just going to say that this is, whenever there have been successes, wins for farm workers, there's always then also been pushback and workarounds. And what I think this is eventually going to end up going to court, because the practice of, if this is employer provided housing, it's whose right supersedes the other person's right. So when we think in terms of farm workers, and the practice has been, this is their home, so they can have guests, they should have access to come and go freely. That's been the way that it has been and that it should be. But what growers or farmers, labor contractors or whatever, then they're saying, this is on my land. I have the right to protect my land. And so I think that there's going to eventually be a court battle about it, because it's a way that growers, labor contractors can prevent access to farm workers. So you have some people who are like, well, if you're coming in to train them about their rights, then they're going to be harder to work with. They're going to demand more, you know what I mean? So I don't want that. But I have found a lot of folks that are doing migrant ministries who recognize that farm workers need to know what their rights are, but they try to find really almost secret ways to share it with them, because otherwise they can't come to bring the things that farm workers also need, which can be food and clothing, access to health care, and those kind of things. I've seen and heard presentations by people where it's just this terrible balance of, I don't want to lose access to be able to help them and to know that there's care in the outside world. On the other hand, I don't want to see them treated like this. And so you have growers who, if they don't perceive that this person will be a threat, they're like, oh yeah, you can give them food. That's fine, because that's less they are responsible for. So it's this like terrible cycle that goes on. So I think that's what we're going to see, is that it eventually is going to go to court. And I think it's in such rural places. A lot of people don't pay attention or even know.
Is anybody in there like the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center or some organization that might get it into the courts?
So folks are looking at it, but you have to
Okay.
keep in mind that you've got a set of people who are working to provide money for their families. Even though they're mistreated, they don't want to lose the opportunity to support their families. So it's just like this perfect storm. It's kind of like having created the overtime bill. I mean, the intention of the overtime bill was, when farm workers are working 16 hours a day, they could make more money. So the workaround to that legislation in just about every state that's enacted it has been that growers have said, okay, I'm only going to work them 40 hours at the rate that they have. I'm not paying overtime. So I have to have more workers. So then what happens is the workers who used to work 16 hours now are only getting to work 8 hours a day, right? Their paycheck is smaller because they're not working cumulatively, they're not getting the same amount of money. So when you go to say to them, so we're not overworking your body, right? But they're not making what they used to make. So they're getting this natural sort of, and they're highlighting the pushback of it, because it's bad for them. You know what I mean? But if you're talking about generally people in desperate financial situations, so they will not speak up. They'll go to worse house. I talked to a guy who said his housing was terrible at this one place, but he got more hours. So he went there. He had a choice and he went there, and you're thinking, oh my goodness. But look at the choice they have to make. So here's the challenge for ACLU or any advocacy is that when you highlight that, then you potentially are going to put people out of work. So it's a real, that terrible exploitation that happened in Georgia got to the point that it was so bad. People were frightened, people were hurt, so uncovering that, and then they got some financial, but it took several years. the farm workers that participated in that case went into what's the equivalent of witness protection program. So they're sort of in that particular cycle until everything is resolved and they actually get some money. But that's a series of years that they're not doing, their lives are upended, right? So all of that plays into the capacity. We don't have enough investigators. Even for me, when I talk to people that live in communities and they say, if I notice this, I think I'm going to speak up about it. I say, be really careful. If you work with domestic violence, that just your decisions about somebody else's life aren't appropriate, right? You have to ask them, like when it's appropriate to do what and what they want. You can't just decide for them. And this is a similar case, just because of those circumstances of severe, just this terrible need for finances. They unfortunately are willing to suffer through a lot of stuff. So how do you change the psyche of the person that doesn't mind abusing them in
Yeah.
those circumstances? That's my struggle. You know what I mean? Like, and for people of faith that, a lot of times that becomes a matter of the heart. And how do you do that? I mean, you and I know we don't just do it. That's something that happens internally. We might interrupt it. We might, I hope, inspire it, provoke it, or whatever. But along the way, it's pretty challenging. Yeah.
Thanks, Julie. Thank
I
you.
just
Thank you,
wanted
Julie.
to add real quickly, the farm workers in Colorado have lost housing because because of the law, they didn't qualify anymore for the rental assistance that they were getting.
Mhm. There are a whole set of different things going on in different places. And unfortunately, there's a whole set of workarounds that constantly happen whenever there's exploitation. And I want to be, and I see there's another hand, but I want to be fair about sometimes when folks, like in North Carolina, we have found some of the labor camps that there's more problems with drug abuse and that kind of thing. So I do understand that there are times when we think we need to protect workers from those kinds of outside entities that might come. But there's a balance somewhere and it's hard to find it. And we use that as an excuse sometimes because we just don't want them to know what their rights are. But
Yeah.
I think Pat has a question. Is that right?
Yes, I want to give the full support of the Loretto community to Elizabeth, because to work in Texas has to be hell. Because
Yeah.
the governor of Texas is a dictator. He's a local state dictator,
Mhm.
and he sees himself above the law, sees himself not as a member of the United States, but of Texas, period. And that's true of the Attorney General also.
Mm.
And so I want you to know that you have our full support for the courageous ways in which you are trying to do whatever you can in the state of Texas. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. That means a lot. Here in Texas, the governor publicly announced that the migrant issue was because of the nonprofits that are here to assist, migrants. And a lot of the places on the border, they had people show up and screaming and yelling at us because, he falsely accused us of encouraging people. And we're not going to encourage anybody to cross the border illegally. There's barbed wire. And a lot of people have lost their lives. A lot of children, a lot of babies have crossed their lives. I have a close colleague of mine who works on the other side of the border with several nonprofits that are there to assist the people that are waiting for asylum. And I've seen personally the barbed wire. I've heard the stories. I've seen the people mourn and cry for their lost loved ones. And it's inhumane, the treatment. It's you know, it should be against the law.
Well, I
Ju-
know that we are way beyond the hour that we always try to stay to, but I just want to say one thing about Texas, since I live in Texas also, Elizabeth. And one more thing about the insanity of Texas is that today is the opening of the annual Texas State Fair. And last year, there was a shooting on the grounds of the State Fair, and 3 people were wounded. So the organization that runs the Texas State Fair has put out a ruling that says this year, no guns will be allowed. And the Texas Attorney General has filed suit to allow guns to be allowed on the property of the state fair this year. And the initial judge ruled against him. He appealed it. The appeals court declined to even take the case. And now yesterday he appealed it to the state Supreme Court because he wants people to be able to carry their goddamn guns to the Texas State Fairgrounds. That's the insanity in Texas.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Julie and Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here and helping us understand how many layers there are on all these issues and how different they are in different parts of the country. And we have, as Loretto, signed on as an organization, and I'll go ahead and resend the information to sign on as individuals. We look forward to the event in October 16th, the next webinar. I will share that information too. And for you two, take care of yourselves. This is heavy, heavy heart work. And we
Yeah.
so appreciate you doing this with our name attached to it. But you're out there in the trenches, as it were. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You make our heart lighter, so thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for supporting our
Okay.
efforts, for helping us get the word out there to the community.
And the recording of this Immigration Spotlight will be available soon. And so you can rewatch it or share it with folks that